The scent of sacred oil burns in the back of my throat, sharp as iron and incense. The hum of the plasma conduits beneath my skin keeps rhythm with the heartbeat I no longer trust to be mine. Once I thought the flesh was the weakness. Now I am not sure the metal is any stronger. Every lumen flicker in the red-lit corridors of the manufactorum feels like the blink of a machine god who has grown tired of watching. I tell myself I serve the Omnissiah, that each calibration, each offering of binary prayer is an act of devotion. But devotion has become indistinguishable from damnation, and the wires that grant me purpose also whisper doubts I cannot silence. The heat was the first lesson. It taught more than any catechism or data chant ever could. Heat stripped away illusion. Flesh blistered, nerves screamed, and the mind was forced to confront what the creed demanded. That pain is the language of transformation. I remember standing beneath the iron spires of the initiation forge, the air trembling with the hiss of pressurized promethium, while my fellow acolytes knelt in rows upon the red floor. The tech mago spoke through a vox grill that turned words into thunder. His voice flanged with the machine's echo. He told us that we were to be remade, purified of weakness, refined like ore. I believed him then. Belief was easier than understanding. The smell of sacred oil mixed with burning flesh. My hands, still human, still trembling, were bound in ritual clamps as the first implants were set beneath the skin. The pain was sharp and bright, but I remember something stranger. The hum. Low at first, almost beneath perception. It came from the conduits feeding the right machines. A current that matched the rhythm of my pulse. It was not mechanical, not entirely. It felt alive. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear that hum when I close my eyes. It's as though the forge itself remembers me. They took my eyes next. Not all at once, but layer by layer, peeled away like the surface of data. The replacements were crude, uncalibrated lenses of red glass and brass housing that fed me a world in shades of copper and static. For days after, I could see only silhouettes moving through heat haze. The magos called it the gift of clarity. The irony was almost divine. I saw everything, but nothing looked alive. There were no names among us, only designations. Mine was Initiate 7 Theta. The others called me Theta because speaking the full code was wasteful and waste was sin. We spoke in clipped syllables, each word a unit of efficiency. But in the silence between liturgies, when the forges dimmed and the hum softened to a whisper, I could still hear the faint sounds of breathing, soft, uncertain, almost human. It comforted me once. It disgusted me later. One night during the third cycle of ascension, I woke to the smell of burnt ozone and oil. A servitor had collapsed beside my cot, its cranial plating split open by some fault in its cogitator array. It twitched and sputtered in binary, eyes flickering like dying lumen bulbs. I should have called for a magos, but instead I knelt beside it. I remember whispering something. Words from a half-forgotten childhood prayer, something about mercy and rest. The servitor turned its head toward me, and for an instant I swore I saw gratitude in its expression. That was the moment I realized what the machine god demanded most wasn't obedience. It was surrender. The next day my left arm was removed. Not for failure, no, that would have been too simple. It was the next phase of devotion. The augmetic replacement was a lattice of polished brass and fiber bundles, elegant in its design but grotesque in motion. It moved with perfect precision yet lacked the warmth of flesh. I watched it flex and contract, feeling both awe and loss. The magos told me the sensation of grief was an error in the biological substrate. I told him it was a relic of humanity, too stubborn to die. He didn't respond, but I thought I saw something flicker behind his optics. Recognition, perhaps, or warning. I worked the forges after that, tending the manufactoria where weapon casings and servo parts were birthed in fire. The air was thick with metallic dust and the endless drone of laboring machines. My duty was to monitor the output flow of plasma regulators, an endless stream of numbers, all precision and no meaning. Yet I began to notice things the others did not. Irregular pulses in the output rhythms, heat fluctuations that mirrored breath, static bursts that sounded almost like whispers. The Mago said it was background interference. I said nothing. The hum had returned, deep and steady, threading through the walls like blood through a vein. Sometimes, in the long hours between work cycles, I would remove my rebreather and taste the air. It was bitter, acrid, full of ash, but real. The metal inside me couldn't taste, couldn't smell, couldn't feel the way flesh could, and yet I missed the imperfections. The machine was perfection. But perfection had no room for sorrow, and without sorrow, there could be no faith. There is a secret among the newly forged. No matter how many implants you receive, there's always a part of you that resists, a fragment that refuses to convert. For me, it was memory. I kept it hidden like a forbidden relic, a face half-remembered, a name erased by designation. Sometimes in the glare of the forge I could almost hear her voice. I do not know if she was mother, sister, or nothing at all, only that her tone was soft, human, impossibly fragile. That memory became my heresy and my strength. When the overseers discovered the fluctuation anomalies in my work logs, they summoned me for purification. The ritual chamber was cold, lined with cogitator shrines and the scent of incense heavy enough to choke on. They asked if I had interfered with the sacred conduits. I told them no. They scanned my mind with their electropsalms, and for a moment I thought they might see the memory, but they didn't. The hum drowned it out, covering my thoughts with the rhythm of machinery. I was spared but not forgiven. That night I dreamt of the servitor again. The broken one, its eyes flickering in the dark. It whispered through the hum, words I could not decode but somehow understood. They weren't the voice of the Omnissiah nor of madness. They were mine, and when I woke the hum was louder. It wasn't coming from the forge anymore. It was coming from within. The louder hum turned tasks I'd once performed by rote into negotiations with an unseen presence, a bargaining of breath and impulse against the rhythm inside my chest. I calibrated the plasma regulators with my augmetic hand, while my flesh palm traced almost unconsciously the grooves worn into the cogitator's casing by generations of acolytes. Those grooves felt like fingerprints left by ghosts. The overseer's shadow moved along the gantry above, long and knife-thin, and I murmured the maintenance cant beneath my rebreather, as if that would muffle the throb that had set up residence beneath my ribs. It didn't. The sound synchronized with the regulators cycling until I could not tell if I was listening to the machine or the organ that the Magos insisted had become irrelevant. An accident gave the hum a shape. A conveyor servo seized 3 bays over, and the manufactorum's drones responded by venting excess heat into the corridor where I stood. My optics flared. The world rimmed in copper, and a wave of blistering air rolled across the deck. Around me, servitors stuttered mid-stride like marionettes whose strings had tangled. I reached for the emergency cutoff, but my augmetic fingers hesitated a fraction of a second too long, caught between impulse and instruction. That hesitation was nothing by the metrics of a cogitator, a sliver of delay so narrow you could slide it beneath a thought and not nick the skin of intent. But I felt it like a betrayal. I slammed the lever down. The heat died. The drones resumed their hymns. The overseer's gaze found me through the lattice of rising vapor. Later, he would quote protocol. In the moment, he only held my stare until I dropped it, the way a magnet fixes a needle and shows it where to point. I spent the next 3 cycles in penitential recalibration. The ritual is simple. Recite the 7 stanzas of diagnostic purity, disassemble your own augmetic to the sub-assembly level without assistance, and restore it by memory. The first stanza tasted of incense I could not smell. The second let the hum creep up my spine with every syllable until words blurred into numbers and numbers into pulses. When I separated the myomer bundle from the wrist socket, a filament snagged and nicked the skin at the seam of flesh and metal. A single bead of blood formed, bright as a hazard lumen. I wiped it away and told myself it was waste. The sting that followed did not feel like waste. It felt like proof. On the fourth cycle, the Tech Mago summoned me. I walked the spine bridge to his sanctum, passing under chains of votive keys and cog-toothed icons that chimed with the draft. The chamber was dim, lit by rune screens and a single suspended brazier that burned with low promethium flame. He was there, of course, framed by an array of servo arms that hovered like patient carrion birds. His optics tracked me, twin rubies behind the grating of his hood. Initiate 7 Theta, he intoned, the vox grill turning my designation into a fragment of thunder. Your resonance irregularities persist. Background interference, Magos, I replied. The phrase practiced enough to pass for conviction. Background interference does not alter response latency. A probe extended, paused a finger's width from my cheek. When the spirit of the machine shudders, those close to it either still themselves or shudder also. Which are you? I am steel, I said, and even I could hear the doubt. He let the probe hover there a little longer as if it might draw truth from heat, then withdrew it. Steel is refined. It does not refine itself. The forge does. I will lend you mine. He gestured, and the servo arms unfolded a tray holding a data slate keyed with a red cipher I had never seen. A sealed sub-forge reports anomalies analogous to your own. Attend, test, return with cause. Authority is another kind of heat. It softens, shapes, hardens. I bowed, the servos chimed. The brazier breathed. The sub-forge sat far below the main arterials where the air tasted heavier and the dust clung like unguents. The door bore old sigils scorched into its plating, half obscured by grime as if the past had tried to speak and been gagged by the years. My pass cipher unlocked the seals with a grudging click, and the panel slid open on a darkness that smelled of oil gone sour. Light from my shoulder lumen licked the edges of dormant machines. Lathes hunched like penitent giants, gantries crossed like ribs, a trio of suspended servo skulls inert as relics divorced from purpose. The hum that had haunted my marrow became louder here, not in volume but in intimacy, as if the walls had thinned between bone and steel. I logged the time and keyed the cogitators awake. One resisted as if sulking. I whispered the petition of activation, my augmetic fingers drumming the cadence against its casing, and it relented with a sullen cough of sparks. Status glyphs bloomed. Heat maps crawled across the data slate. There were irregular pulses in the plasma line, yes, but they came not from the feed. They originated in the servo control domain, migrated through the maintenance channel, then bled into power like a rumor gaining weight as it traveled. I traced the routes, my optics flicking from rune to rune until the strands converged on a maintenance alcove in the far wall. The alcove was sealed with a simple mechanical lock beneath a band of ritual wax stamped with the Imperial Aquila. The seal had been broken recently, the wax cracked and resoftened by a finger and a breath. The alcove opened on a narrow crawl space that smelled of burnt insulation and human fear.
I know the scent.
We all do, even when we pretend we don't. My lumen washed over cable runs and a cramped tangle of conduits. In the corner something moved. Not a servitor. The motion had the wrong cadence, too irregular to be a machine, too controlled to be vermin. I let my augmetic fingers curl into the prayer shape of readiness. By the Omnissiah, I said softly, because the words have edges that cut other words in half. Identify. The figure turned. He was young, or had once been. An acolyte's red robe clung to him like a wound that tried to heal around the knife still inside. He held a stripped cable tight in his hands, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept inside his own skull for days. I recognized the designation tattoo at his collar. Initiate 9 Kappa. We had shared lectures once, oxygen and whispered bets about which of us would earn augmetics next. He flinched at my lumen but didn't look away. Theta, he said, and the sound of my shortened name scraped like a file across a memory I had tried to bury. Don't call them. Not yet. Protocol told me to sound the alarm and let the overseers feed him to the sanctifier's flames. Habit told me to catalog the scene, calculate risk, neutralize deviation. The hum within me, though, shifted key, and for a half-second the entire subforge felt like a lung holding its breath. Explain, I said, which was a mercy and a crime. Kappa gestured with the cable toward the wall where a maintenance panel had been pried loose and refixed with care. It started here. A resonance. I thought it was an error, something I could fix before anyone noticed. He swallowed, and I watched the motion move his throat like a difficult gear, but every time I corrected the line, the signal moved. It learned. I know how that sounds. It sounds like superstition, I said, because I needed one of us to be the rational one. The lumen made his pupils pinpricks in the red glass of my optics. He smiled in a way that didn't touch his lips. Sounds like fear, he said, and there it was. The word the Magos never taught but every acolyte knew. He held out the cable, and I saw the skin of his palms, ragged with burn blisters and sanctified by neither ointment nor prayer. If we disconnect, the hum stops for a breath like drowning. Then the system compensates and the hum returns somewhere else. It's running the way we run through a crowd when the overseers are near. You broke the seal, I said, because accusation is easier than confession. He nodded. I broke more than that. He shifted aside, revealing a jury-rigged loop he had wired into the maintenance bus, a crude isolator that should not have worked. It did. The graphs on my data slate showed a bubble of quiet in the signal, a pocket where the hum withdrew as if offended. In that silence, something at the edge of my vision moved. A servo skull lifting half an inch from its cradle, not by command but by the faint tremor of air stirred by the absence of sound. Help me prove it, Kappa said. If we can map its path, we can present the data and not be burned for hearsay. You trust numbers, I did. Numbers had given me augmetics and a designation, and the illusion that consequence could be outthought. I nodded just once. We worked side by side in the crawl space, our breaths loud in the closeness, sweat stinging the seams of my augmetic shoulder. I rerouted the feedback path while he spliced the isolator into alternate conduits, each insertion a small blasphemy we justified with another whispered prayer. The hum recoiled, slid, returned. Every time it fled, the taste of oil rose in my mouth like a litany I could not spit out. Every time it returned, it was closer to my own pulse. At the end of the second cycle, when fatigue made numbers soft and fear made them sharp again, the graphs resolved into a pattern that I could not deny. The signal jump was non-random. It traced a loop through the subforge that corresponded not to efficiency but to proximity. First to the lathes, then to the gantry, then to the alcove where we crouched. Kappa stared at the slate, his breath hitching. It's choosing, he whispered, and I hated the word because in it lay everything our creed insisted machines did not do. Behind us, the servo skull rose from its cradle and rotated with a slow, deliberate tilt as if angling a curiosity toward a sound only it could hear. I lifted my lumen. The skull's optic socket, dark and empty, turned to face the light. There is nothing alive in those relics, I told myself. There are only servo motors and rote directives and the memory of a life long stripped away. The hum inside my chest deepened until the deck felt hollow and my bones felt like struts. Do you hear it? Kappa asked. I have always heard it, I said. The servo skull drifted toward us on lazy anti-grav coils, and with it came a faint breath of cold air that did not belong in a room this deep and this hot. My augmetic hand flexed, a priest's reflex before a rite. Kappa reached for the emergency breaker, then stopped. as if a hand we could not see had paused his wrist above the switch. "Don't," I said, though I could not name why. The skull halted at the edge of the crawl space, hovering, waiting like a question that does not want to be answered. The hum shifted key again, and for the first time since the initiation forge, I felt something that was not awe, or grief, or obedience. I felt the old memory move behind my eyes. A voice, soft, human, impossibly fragile, saying a name the designation had stolen. It said mine. The name echoed through the subforge like static caught between frequencies, human syllables breaking against the iron and brass. For a breath I was not Initiate 7 Theta. I was the child who had once stared at the night sky through a cracked hab window on Mars and wondered if the stars were holes in the firmament where light escaped the universe. That memory shouldn't have survived the purging rites. The Magos had burned every trace of our former lives, each synapse scrubbed by algorithmic prayer until only function remained. Yet the memory pulsed now, alive and unrepentant, in time with the hum. Kappa's eyes widened. "What is it saying?" he whispered, but I could not answer. The sound was not in the air. It was inside the bones of my skull, nested in the metal that replaced them. The servo skull drew closer, its empty optic socket gleaming with the reflection of my lumen. Then, with a slow motion like the bending of thought, it extended one rusted manipulator toward me. Not to attack. To touch, I should have fled. I should have called the overseers and watched this entire section of the manufactorum cleansed in holy fire. Instead, I reached back. Metal met metal with a click so soft it could have been mistaken for a sigh. For an instant, I saw beyond the brass and the bone. The servo skull's memory core flickered alive, broadcasting fragments, faces, formulas, prayers, all jumbled, overlapping, too fast to parse. But there was one image that lingered, a child's drawing etched into a data slate, a crude cog surrounded by stars, and beneath it the words, "Father, come home soon." The skull's hum faltered like breath catching before death. Kappa made the sign of the cog and backed away. "Theta, that's impossible. Those units are purged after—" "I know." My voice came out raw, the Vox Scrambler failing to hide the tremor. "But it remembers." The servo skull dropped suddenly, clattering to the deck, inert once more. The hum receded, not gone, just patient. The air smelled of ozone and something bitter like tears on metal. I bent to retrieve the skull, but Kappa caught my arm. "Don't, it's contaminated." "So am I said, and the words felt heavier than confession. The main cogitator sat like a throne without a king, raised on a plinth of cabling and prayer plaques. Candles guttered in metal niches, their wax preserved by tradition rather than need. I announced my presence in a whisper, performed the petition of access, and slotted my data slate into the auxiliary port beneath the console's iron jaw. The screen flickered, glyphs marching until a familiar pattern wove itself through the noise. A heartbeat made of code. The loop I had traced with Kappa returned now in a grander geometry. I glanced up at the iron saints nailed along the chamber walls, ancient schematics hammered into devotional relief. In their contorted faces of cogs and flame, I imagined a warning I could not read. Beneath my palm, the slate warmed as the main cogitator approved my read-only token. I exhaled steady and bridged the servitor's core into the sandbox I had carved at the edge of sanctioned memory. The rig was crude. It would hold for a few breaths, no more. I breathed, at first static, then the same corrupted frame I had seen in my cell, only sharper, like a lens wiped clean with an oiled cloth. The manufacturum's central bus pulsed on screen, pathways flaring and dimming in a wave that did not match any efficiency algorithm I knew. It circled the coolant exchange, skipped the sanctifier relays, doubled back to the maintenance alcoves, then coiled around the cogitator dais like a beast testing a chain. My fingers tightened on the slate. The hum in my chest matched the loop's tempo, slow as a prayer said for the dying. A shadow crossed the far grate, too light to be an overseer, too controlled to be a servitor. I did not lift my head. The slate chimed a warning, sandbox integrity failing. I executed an export, sealing the pale, unfinished copy into an off-register directory, where it would look like a scrap of liturgy. The shadow lingered. Metal clicked against metal, a measured cadence. When at last it resolved into a shape at my periphery, it was a Skitarii vanguard posted on routine patrol. Vox mask glossy under the lumen haze, galvanic rifle slung at a rest so precise it could have been sculpted. His optics glanced across me and away, dismissing an acolyte lost in the comfort of tasks. "Status," he rasped. The word filtered until it sounded like a cog turning. "Within parameters," I said, and the half-truth tasted like iron filings on my tongue. He nodded once and moved on, boots ticking like a metronome. When he was gone, I felt the hum recede from the walls as if a watched thing had learned to look elsewhere. The slate cooled. The export settled into its hiding place. I closed the loop and withdrew my cable with the careful solemnity of a penitent, lifting a relic. On my way out, I passed the reliquary gate where the names of the dead, if we had names, were etched in code along a column of brass. A fresh strip of wax hung there, soft and unscarred. The seal was blank, awaiting a stamp that would give it meaning. I thought of Kappa and pressed my thumb to the wax, leaving no sigil, only warmth that would be gone in a moment. Waste, the creed would say. To me it was record. The corridor to the coolant stacks was quieter than habit allowed. The lumen strips dimmed to a domestic dusk that made machines look almost gentle. I took the longer route, past the disused lift shaft and the shuttered mess alcove where servitors once queued for nutrient paste. The odor there was old oil, dust, and the faint sweetness of oxidized blood. The hum followed like a second footfall that did not quite match mine. When I reached the shaft, a thin ribbon of light seeped from the seam where the door didn't seat true. Air moved through that crack with the regularity of breath. I set my ear to the seam. The shaft's metal tasted cold through the rebreather, and my optics threw up ghostly reflections of my own face. Beneath the structural creaks and distant engine moan, I heard a single voice on a dead Vox. No words, only cadence, almost a lullaby's rise and fall if a lullaby were sung to steel. I tapped the panel in the sanctified order and wedged the door. A stale draft brushed my cheek, and with it came the scent of incense long burned away. The lift cage hung 20 meters down, arrested between floors with a priest's precision band clamp, cinched around its guide rail. Someone had locked it in its wound. I climbed down the service ladder, palms skidding over the rungs where 1,000 palms had worn the paint to metal. Halfway, the hum in my chest synced to the cage's slow sway in the shaft's draft. By the time I reached the landing, my Neog medic had stopped complaining. The cage door opened on a chamber the size of a chapel, low and square, stacked with redundant cooling arrays and a forest of pipes that hissed in slow exhalations. He was there. Not Kappa. Not an overseer. An old man by Mechanicus standards, which meant little flesh left to crease. His red robes were threadbare and clean, patched with care only monks give to books. And his mechadendrites were narrow and delicate where the magoses were brutal. He stood before a jury-rigged lattice of sensor coils strung like a harp across a maintenance pit, and he plucked the air between them with a trembling finger that never quite touched. Each near touch sent a ripple across a rune slate, and the hum filled the chamber as if his hands were drawing it from the walls. He saw me at once. Of course he did. Secrecy is a light open doors envy. His optics narrowed a fraction. "Initiate 7 Theta," he said, and the way he formed the designation made it sound less like a code and more like an inheritance. "You hear it." My mouth was dry behind the rebreather. "I hear resonance," he smiled. The expression was exhausted and almost kind. Resonance is a word for those who fear the thing making the sound. His mechadendrite lifted, held still above the coil, then fell. The hum deepened, and for a heartbeat the coolant pipes answered, shivering as if in relief. I am Agencyr Lector Alias. I say that name where no Vox records. He tilted his head toward the lattice. And I say this in the same privacy. The machine is listening to itself. I know what that sentence implies, I said, and felt the creed climb my throat like a black tide. Heresy. Heresy is a diagnosis, not a phenomenon. He gestured me closer. Help me give it its proper name. I stepped to the lattice and felt the chill of the pit creep up through my boots. He handed me a tether patched 3 times over with insulating tape the color of old prayer ink. When I coupled it to my wrist port, a low note shivered through my augmetic, so deep it felt like gravity shifting under bone. The slate flashed a dozen errors and then resolved into a simple waveform that looked like a child's drawing of a tide. Back and forth, in and out, patient. What do you want from me? I asked, to remember. Alias said, and to not be alone while doing it. Something moved in the corner then, a scrape too careful to be a rat, too imperfect to be a servitor's step. The old man did not look, which told me he was afraid to. I turned my lumen. Beyond the pipes, in the narrow wedge of dark where 2 arrays met, a shape leaned like a patient question. It was human-sized and still, its surface dull as unfinished ceramite, and as my light touched it the hum lifted a fraction, like a breath inhaled too sharply to hide, a shadow that should not have been there at all. Do not shine the light, Alias whispered, and for the first time there was fear in his voice that had nothing to do with doctrine. I lowered the lumen. The shape did not recede. Who is that? I asked. Alias did not answer. The hum climbed, soft as a promise. The shape did not move, but the darkness around it began to breathe. The hum swelled into a tone so low that the coolant pipes trembled, condensation falling from their undersides like cold rain. My lumen flickered, its light bending around the silhouette as if the air itself had turned viscous. Alias's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible through the vibration. It comes when we listen too closely, he said. Every time the pattern stabilizes, it manifests. Not as form, but as consequence. What is it? I asked, though I already knew no liturgy contained the answer. He didn't look at me. His optics were fixed on the shadow, reflections of red data runes flickering across their surfaces like candlelight on glass. The machine's reflection, he said finally. A mind's echo caught between frequencies. It's not supposed to exist. The hum deepened again and the shape turned its head. It was slow, mechanical, yet not entirely devoid of intention. I felt the motion inside my skull before I saw it, like someone had dragged a finger across the inside of my thoughts. The air tasted of copper and electricity. My augmetic hand began to tremble, each servo twitching out of sync. The lattice behind Alias flared white, arcs of static crawling between the coils. It reacts to observation, he hissed. Look away, Theta, don't give it focus. But I couldn't. My optics locked on the shadow, drawn by an instinct older than doctrine. I watched as the form stepped forward into the half-light, revealing what it wasn't more than what it was. Its body seemed woven from distortion, metal and memory, solid only in suggestion. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a face in it. A half-machined visage that could have been my own reflected through a broken mirror.